and Sarah saved some things and sitting down. But same thing as last time, we'd really like to have a conversation at the end. Wes won't be joining us up here because he refuses to talk about anything that is not said in Tennessee, but he also knows a lot and would be happy to chime in during the discussion. So the organizers of the festival asked us to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Blood Meridian, and we thought that was a great idea. So, okay, 40th anniversary, when was this book published?
85?
Sometimes a dangerous question to ask a literary festival to get involved with math, but yes, that is correct. 1985, and so this is his 5th book. We talked about his Tennessee period. Those were the last panel. That was the first 4 books through 79, and then 85 he writes this one. So the first 4 Tennessee novels are set in the 20th century largely, right here in East Tennessee. And then we get this, an epic story set in the 1830s about the Desert West, the border with Mexico, American westward expansion, territorial disputes, and human behavior in the midst of violence and chaos. It feels completely different. As I think both Wes and Sarah mentioned last time, sometime in the 70s, McCarthy moved from East Tennessee, where he was moving around, to El Paso, partly to sort of learn about the Southwest desert landscape. And this book is now considered his masterpiece. Famous literary critic Harold Bloom called it one of the greatest American novels ever written, and it frequently shows up on top American book rankings, top 10 or stuff like that. But when it came out 40 years ago, readers weren't sure what to make of it. We were talking before, it didn't sell very well. And this is partly because, I think, it's a weird book that resists expectations. It's hard to know what to do with this on the first time you read it. It is this larger-than-life historical tale that doesn't have a traditional hero, doesn't have, in fact, the person who you might say is a hero in this book disappears for like hundreds of pages at a time where he's just not part of the story. It doesn't really have a coherent plot, at least in the traditional plot form that we've learned about. It doesn't have a clear resolution. And it goes on tangents one wouldn't expect in a traditional epic or in a traditional Western even. So it's sort of set up in some ways that makes us think of a Western. It has, at the beginning of each chapter, it has sort of major plot points of the chapter, which is something you might find in early sort of dime novel Westerns. But it plays with genres, and so the readers aren't sure what to do with the novel. So I think when it first came out, people just said, I wonder what that is. And I think another reason why people received the book with so much uncertainty is its nearly overwhelming proliferation of violence. How many of you have read this book? There are just death after death, violent scene after scene. There are, I think one of my students once counted it, over 200 deaths mentioned in here. Sometimes in graphic details, sometimes in numbing, just sort of like, oh, somebody died over there. So the violence is a key part of it. McCarthy's writing more generally tends to have a lot of violence on it. And I think in it, one of the ways to think about it, I think, comes from one of the rare interviews that he gave in 1992. So I think he was talking about maybe his upcoming book, but obviously people were thinking about this one. And here's what he said. He said, "There's no such thing as life without bloodshed. I think the notion that the species could be improved in some way, that everyone could live in harmony, is really a dangerous idea. Those who are afflicted with this notion are the first ones to give up their souls, their freedom. Your desire that it be that way will enslave you and make your life vacuous." So the last part of that, I'll leave alone here for a second, but I think that idea I think what he says is that violence and bloodshed are an inevitable part of the human experience. And I think he says that what we like to do is say we are becoming more cultured, more civilized, and society is getting away from that. We are becoming less violent. And I think he thinks that's dangerous and also inaccurate. So he's interested in the way that violence is a part of humanity, even when we don't want to recognize it, and also that it erupts in sort of predictable ways. So one way to think about that is this book begins with 3 epigraphs, so 3 quotes from other authors. And one of them is from a 1982 Yuma Daily Sun article. So it's just from a newspaper, and it quotes, I think it's an archaeologist named Clark, who is doing some work in Ethiopia, and it said that he found or re-examined a 300,000-year-old skull that had evidence of having been scalped. And I think that's an epigraph in this book because there's scalpions in this book too, both from the indigenous people who sort of, but also the filibusters, these American military sort of renegades who were scalping people they found too. So this idea of something that happened 300 years or 300,000 years ago is also erupting in our American situation, gets to that idea of, you know, the sort of cyclical nature of violence in human culture. But I think another part, unexpected, unusual part of this novel is, like I said, there's no real hero that we can identify as a hero, but there is sort of an arch nemesis, Judge Holden. He's this perplexing character, and he is, in some ways, people see him as evil incarnate. Some people compare him to the devil. So he is this very evil character, but he's also described in a very unusual way, especially his physical traits, in a way that maybe is hard to think about an evil character in this way. So he's most known for his violent acts and his philosophical, sort of mysterious philosophical utterances. But I think it's interesting, McCarthy's imaginative description of his physical appearance. He is by all, so this is talking about the judge. He is by all accounts huge. He is nearly 7 feet tall, we learn, and he's described in the book as 24 stone, which I had to look up, but that's 336 pounds. So he's a 340-pound, 7-foot tall, very round, and without a hair on his body. So he almost becomes even sort of mythical in his appearance. And he frequently wanders the desert scenes in this book, naked or nearly naked, even in the blaring heat. And he has a surprisingly delicate gait. So even though he's this huge, massive person, he moves around very tenderly and very delicately. So I thought one way to give us the sense of the weird way he's described, so think about this as, in some ways, the arch villain. We get a scene of where he gets a rare chance to take a bath. And if you can imagine being out in the wilderness in the 1830s, there's not very many baths around. So this is one of the few times where he sort of delicately dips his toe in the water, checking the heat. And here's the description we get. He shone like the moon, so pale he was, and not a hair was to be seen anywhere on that vast corpus, not in any crevice, nor in any great bores of his nose, and not upon his chest, nor in his ears, nor any tuft at all above his eyes, nor the lids thereof. The immense and gleaming dome of his naked skull looked like a cap for bathing, pulled down to an otherwise darkened skin of his face and neck. He looked about with considerable pleasure, with eyes slightly crinkled, as if he were smiling under the water, like some pale and bloated manatee surfaced in a bog. So here we have the major villain of this described as a bloated manatee surfacing in a bog. So even there, it's, later on he's compared to a great pale deity, and one time his bald head is described as being as shining like an enormous phosphorescent egg. So, we usually think of, we can conjure images of what devils might look like, and like I said, he's sometimes compared to the devil. But it's rarely that we conjure up an image of a bloated manatee or enormous phosphorescent egg in those images. So, he's playing with our expectations there. I think another defining characteristic of the novel is the relentless descriptions and almost monotonous descriptions we get of the novel's landscape. They're going through the desert, and we just get page after page, scene after scene of a meticulous description of what he's seeing around him. It's beautiful, it's very particular, but it's also a little bit repetitive sometimes. And I think he's trying to give us a sense of the oppressive repetitiveness of what this group is doing. They're going out in the desert, they're trying to fight people that they see as being against U.S. expansion. And they're sort of numb to it, and I think this sort of repetition of their actions is replicated in the style of the book in a weird way. So the writing style is almost repeating what the journeys are like. One critic said, the book sort of unfolds like a relentless horizontal expansion. I think that's a good way to think about it. It's just this sort of endless going on. And there's a famous tagline that appears in the book, "They rode on." He writes that over and over again. So this is a guy with maybe one of the most creative and extensive vocabularies in American literature that I can think of, and he uses the same phrase over and over, "They rode on." I thought I would read a passage that sort of shows this repetition of that, but then also the way that he is also very invested in giving us a sense of what they're riding through as they are riding. So here's a quote. "Rode on into the mountains, and their way took them through high pine forests, wind in the trees, lonely bird calls. They rode up switchbacks through a lonely aspen wood, where the fallen leaves lay like golden biscuits in the damp black trail. The leaves shifted in a million spangles down the pale corridors. They rode through a narrow draw where the leaves were shingled up in ice. And they crossed a high saddle at sunset where wild doves were rocketing down the wind and passing through the gap a few feet off the ground. They rode on into a dark fir forest, the little Spanish ponies sucking in at the thin air." So that to me is just a beautiful description of a scene of where they are. There are hundreds of those in this book. A lot of them are sort of similar, but all of them have their own unique parts. And so I think part of what's interesting to me about this is the repetition and the monotony, but also this eruption of surprising language, of really crisp, clear details. And I think part of that leveling that I talked about, or the sort of monotony of it, is he's got this idea that there's a leveling, that when you're in the desert, there's a leveling of the human, the animal, the vegetal, the geological. They all become sort of part of the same scene. He's got this famous quote where he talks about Western desert landscapes and what they do. He says, "In the neuter austerity of that terrain, all phenomena were bequeathed a strange equality, and no one thing, nor spider, nor stone, nor blade of grass, could put forth claim precedence. In this optical democracy of such landscapes, all preferences made whimsical, and a man and a rock become endowed with unguessed kinships." So he's being kind of fancy there, but I think part of what he's interested in is the way that humans think they can exert their power on their landscape, on their society. And when you get out in these barren, vast landscapes, that's really hard to do. So a human becomes more like a rock than they might want to care to admit. So the sameness of this optical democracy, this where everything is equal, is in this book interrupted, I think I mentioned this a little bit, with moments of intense action and unique descriptions. So that's another sort of defining aspect of this. As we read, they're just going through these draws, past these woods, the same kind of plants are being described, and then these eruptions of battles or amazing scenes. I thought I would end with one last, a famous example where Captain White's gang of U.S. military filibusters. You guys know filibusters? This was a sort of like sort of working under the U.S. military, but also kind of going rogue. So they're doing the dirty work of the U.S. military, but weren't quite sanctioned, or weren't officially part of that. So, and this group goes particularly rogue and does things that even outside the things of what people wanted them to do. So, it's a gang of filibusters, and they encounter a band of Comanche warriors. And this is one of the most famous scenes. And just think about the eruption of all these images he has, just creating detail after detail. So this is the first time they see these Comanche warriors after days of wandering in the wilderness. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes, attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animal and silk finery and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and the blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear or crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and paldrooms deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust. So you can see why if you pick this book up in 1985, not knowing the author and not knowing, it could be a little bit overwhelming, right? That's almost like an overwhelming amount of different kinds of details. But I think in the end, what he's interested in this book is like the accretion of Western history, as we saw in this passage, the history of conflict and contact between settler and indigenous people. And I think in the end, it becomes about the ugly legacy of the idea of manifest destiny, sort of. It becomes an unromanticized exploration of westward expansion, conflicts with indigenous tribes, with Mexican populations, and along the way we are presented with breathtaking and breathtakingly violent scenes told in a style that feels both epic and mundane at the same time, and all the time uniquely McCarthy. So I think I'll just leave with that, and I'd be happy to talk about any of this stuff later. So thank you.